Hello, everyone. A very warm greetings to all of you from Hong Kong. My name is Yan, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank the ISDS team for inviting me to share my work with you about my use of the dialogical self theory. So, this is the title of my sharing today because I'd like to share with you my research focus on the links between ethno-cultural identities and multi-ethnic learning environments. So to start off, I work as an assistant professor at the Education University of Hong Kong. So personally, I would identify as a Filipino by blood and a Hong Kong Chinese by heart. So I'm happy for you to take this statement further for your analysis, right? And try to figure what that means in terms of the I positions that I have. So that's my own cultural background. So initially, I was trained as a linguist, but as my career progressed here in Hong Kong, so I started to research more and more the issue of non-Chinese, ethnic minority students here in Hong Kong with regards to their education. So that really means my larger research focus has to do with themes around diversity, equity, race, ethnicity, that really tries to um, understand how all of these things play out when we try to understand the relationship between schooling and the development and construction of cultural identities. And of course, I try to take these ideas to help us understand the implications of these for curriculum and practice. So as I mentioned, I am working here in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong has a lot of interesting issues to explore with regards to identity. Because first of all, it is a former British colony, and it's now a special administrative region of China, right, since 1997. So currently, we have about 7 million people, and 92% of the population is Chinese, and the rest, 8%, is non-Chinese, or sometimes we call them ethnic minorities. So they include people like Pakistani, Indian, Nepalese, Filipino, Indonesians, and other Caucasian groups and other minority groups uh, that comprise of a much smaller fraction in terms of the non-Chinese population here in Hong Kong. So when we talk about the diversity of Hong Kong in a very broad sense, there are two competing narratives in my view. One narrative uh, describes Hong Kong as the Asia's world city, right? Typically coming from the advertisements of the government, especially with the ones from the tourism board here that tries to highlight Hong Kong's cosmopolitan aspect, right, where East meets West, and it's a international or the Asia's financial hub and so forth. So that's one narrative. But there's also another narrative, which is shown here, is that it's really coming from a group of scholars and advocacy groups which challenges the claim that, well, that Hong Kong is not as multicultural as you think if you look at its policy, because Hong Kong has no multicultural policy or a pro-diversity policy that um, that explicitly recognizes the rights of ethnic minorities at a broader level, right? We only have anti-racial discrimination laws that protect ethnic minorities or non-Chinese people from being discriminated. But unlike other societies, there are no pro-diversity policies that could take these issues further in terms of trying to recognize their rights more explicitly. So, if we bring these issues to the education context, we know that the ethnocultural dynamics that educators face are less clear in research. What I'm trying to say here is that minority cultures are not always represented in the curriculum. Um, and there are also challenges around um, teacher training, in the sense that teachers are not always trained to teach students from different cultural groups. As I mentioned, diversity policy or diversity initiatives are not necessarily high on the policy agenda, except what the government promotes and what the government stresses here is the Chinese language development of non-Chinese people so that they can integrate into the mainstream community um, in a productive way. So that itself is not an issue, but then when that becomes the only focus, um, then there's a tendency to ignore or sideline the other cultural aspects with regards to the adjustments or the adaptation of non-Chinese learners in Hong Kong's mainstream society. And that brings me to my research agenda. So these are very broad claims. I mean, there are things that I want to do in the near future and in the longer future. So one is that I believe, and we also know from the literature, it's very important to develop positive cultural identities among learners, regardless of your cultural groups. For one, that gives us a firm ground to stand. Right? We're happy about our identities. Right? We're happy to be a Chinese. We're happy to be an Indian. We're happy to be a Filipino. So without without having to worry about your own identity. And second, we're in a better position to adapt to different cultural setting, whether we're working in a multicultural environment or whether we stay here in Hong Kong as a local person. We are in a better position to respect people from other culture, and so we're able to contribute to our society in a positive way. And so ideally, we want these different cultural identities to be acknowledged in different levels of education, such as curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. So, by cultivating identity-safe learning environment, where students don't feel threatened about their own identity, despite having a different cultural background from the mainstream society, and that teachers will know how to engage with different cultural groups, knowing how to work with different students, regardless of their cultural backgrounds, and that educators will hopefully be able to create different learning routes to acknowledge the different abilities and backgrounds of students. So those are the things to for me to explore, and this is the broader context, and which really, if you take these issues further, I think that would somehow hint, my interest in my use of um, Vygotskian perspectives and Bakhtinian perspectives of identity initially, right? Because we know that the development of identity um, comes in part from schools, aside from family, and that we develop different identity positions, and that comes from different voices, coming from different uh, contextual layers, from our peers, our teachers, parents, right, other friendship groups, and so forth. So this paper here is really one of my earlier attempts to try to bridge these both perspectives, which, as I tried to explore further, it, it it's becoming clear that I'm leaning more towards the dialogical self theory to understand the ethnic self positions of minority people, which inspired me to understand that the absence of culturally relevant learning environments in schools could be a contributing factor to the instability of ethnic self, which leads students to question their own identity, such as when students are um, have to learn about Chinese history when they themselves are not Chinese, right? Like where at some point I got like comment from a student I was working with who told me, "Oh well, I'm a Filipino, but why should I bother learning about Chinese history?" Right? So there are some dialogical tensions going on there. So empirically, I used dialogical self-theory in my own doctoral study. So in that research, I don't have time to speak about the logistical aspect of the research, but this is what I found by using dialogical self-theory in my study. I found that Filipinos here in Hong Kong, a group of Filipino students here, they developed for quite distinct eye positions. One is I as a Filipino, but born and raised in Hong Kong. So these are the Filipino students who would highlight the fact that they were born and raised here and that they've developed a pretty strong Hong Kong Filipino identity. And then there's a second I position, I as Filipino, just Filipino, meaning to say that um, they're just Filipinos, who happen to be here in Hong Kong. So this position comes from those have who spent time in the Philippines, who grew up there for a certain period of time, and then moved here to Hong Kong. So they have stronger Filipino identity. And I also found another position which can be described as I as Filipino living in Hong Kong. So similar to the first position, they would describe themselves as Filipinos who have permanent residency here, who grew up here in the schooling system. But what's distinctive about this position is that they are clearer about their um, resident status as compared to the first one, because here this group of students were making a distinction between themselves compared to those who are working here in Hong Kong as um, overseas foreign workers, working here as a nanny or as a domestic helper at home who don't have permanent resident status here in Hong Kong. And another eye position that I was able to identify is a somewhat broader layer, I as ethnic minority in Hong Kong. So this comes from a um, an institutional layer where, because these Filipino students I was working with, they were studying um, in an ethnically diverse schools. They were put together. Um, well, it's a school that with different ethnic groups from Pakistan, Indians and Nepalese, and then you have Filipinos. And from there, they felt that the school was a safe environment for them to study, where they don't have to worry about their ethnic identity, right? And that there's a strong respect um, among different groups of students, right? And which allowed them to develop a broader layer of identity as an ethnic minority. So that's one of the empirical sides of my research. So I was able to work on those empirical aspects more deeply, after I finished my doctoral study, to really to look at the theoretical aspect of this, because as I mentioned initially, I was trying to put together the social cultural aspects of identity and dialogical self together. So tried to summarize this framework and this table, where you can where you can develop external positions in this domain. So we know that in I positions we can develop internal I, internal positions. I as an Arab student. We also have um, another external layer which comes from social relationships with social relationships with from your peers, your friends, and so forth. And it also your I position can also come from what you do, right? Your practices, the language you speak or the instruments that you play that affirms your own ethnic identity. And another layer, which is relations, which is a broader layer compared to relationships. How um, the collective identities or the collective practices that you do with your peers, which itself could be an external precision when you refer to those collective aspects and practices of your identity. And a much broader layer is the institution, right? So when your identity, whether you reject that external position or not, that that external position has become a part of you or a part of your narrative, right? Um, like for example, this is I used Edward Said's and text as an example to illustrate this, right? I hate school because it forces us to speak English all the time. But on the other hand, if you like the school can also become a part of your external position. So this is how I've tried to bring um, the social cultural dimension and I positions in my work more closely. So I tried to take that understanding further to uh, look at the syncretic aspects of ethnic identity. So meaning to say how these different voices or different I positions come together that form a um, an integrative, right? An integrated identity that forms your being as an ethnic person. So, for example, I work with this student, so I asked her to create a video that to talk about her Filipina identity. So, at first, she started with her video questioning her nationality as a Filipino, but then towards the end of the video, she realized that well, to be she's fine with her identity. She's happy with who she is. I am who I am. So I think what's interesting about this work is that there is a very long process for her to come to terms with her unique identity as a Filipino student in Hong Kong. Um, for I tried to describe this figure um, as clearly as I can. Um, because what's interesting about the student's background, Danica, she doesn't speak Tagalog, right? She grew up speaking just English only. Um, when she went to her primary school, that that is culturally diverse, she came across students, also Filipino students who spoke Tagalog. So those classmates of her teased her not being able to speak Tagalog, that made her question her own Filipino identity. And that um, experience, she carried that with her until her secondary school. And then she was also teased by other groups of students, right? She felt lost being a Filipina. But what's interesting about her, she moved to another secondary school where she found new friends, friends who accepted her Filipina identity, and where she felt comfortable, where she had a new set of social relationships with people there. Um, so she tried to combine all her past experiences into her present in that school, with the help of that affirmation from her peers, that at the end made her feel comfortable of who she is, right? Where she claimed, I am who I am. So from here, we can see a trajectory of the development of her identity, and that this identity um, is really composed of different contextual layers, right? So from the things that they do, the peers that she worked with, um, the parents that you work with, and of course, I'm sure there are teachers involved here, but it's just not mentioned in the data that uh, my participant provided to me. But it really shows that through the analysis of her narrative using dialogical self theory, a lot of these issues came to the fore. So to take this work further, I think, and to achieve some of my research agenda, find that it's important to examine people's trajectories of I-positions and meta-positions, and especially to use that knowledge to raise questions about the effects of structural conditions of schooling on student agency, right? How particular environments of schools make us choose our identities explicitly or implicitly, right? How do we make, how do we choose our identities in relation to the environments that we work in or study? And thirdly, here it's important to highlight the multiple borders at work in the developmental trajectory, which pretty much summarizes what I'm trying to say here, to identify the dilemmatic fields where to identify students' points of tensions, right, where they um, at the point where they feel lost about their identities, because that these are the moments that I believe educators or whomever are supporting the students should not ignore, right? Because these identity tensions have implications for both their growth and their own learning. And it's important to know where these are coming from so that we can address these uh, issues in a more proactive way if we are to value the diversity of the students. So I hope this presentation will somehow inspire you or somehow give you a lot of questions to think more about. So I'm happy for you to get in touch with me, whether you have any critiques or any comments about my research, or if you're thinking of working in this area. I'm happy to get in touch with you and to hear from you. Thank you.